Hey, welcome to Playing for Keeps, the show where we take a deep dive into emotional intelligence, sex, love, adult attachment theory, mental health, therapy, and everything in between that creates great relationships. Your host, DJ, is a certified life coach and emotional intelligence practitioner. She's here to be of service to all the listeners interested in love and relationship. Now, here's your host, DJ.
Hey everybody, this is DJ with Plan for Keeps podcast, and today I have a special guest. Janis is a movement specialist. Her business name is Body Conjure. She is also a part-time relationship writer for Elephant Journal, where she speaks about her experiences in dating and body image, attachment and dating trauma, the best dating apps, and everything in between. Today, she is here to speak on attachment and dating trauma. How are you today, Janis?
I am very good. How are you?
I am doing well. I am very happy we were able to connect and that you are here with me today.
I am too.
Awesome. So first, before we dive into the topics, I want to start off, how's your week been?
It's good. You know, I could be done with this pandemic, but I think we all could. So other than that, everything is great.
Awesome. Okay. So everybody has a story. I would like to start off. So you being a movement specialist, I know being in tune with your body is helpful with self-esteem. So I kind of want to dive a little bit into that before I dive into why you started your part-time gig as a relationship writer, because I feel like that's also very important within relationships as well. A relationship with yourself and your body also affects your relationships with other people. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that and how that might relate to your job as a movement specialist before we dive into the relationship piece.
Yeah, so I work with people one-on-one to help them feel better in their body. And really, I work with people that come into me usually with pain, and I'm talking about a sore back, sore hips, sore knees, sore shoulders, things like that. And typically my clients have been to the chiropractor and the massage therapist and possibly a sports doctor, or they've had x-rays or MRIs, and there's nothing that any medical professional can find is quote unquote wrong with them. Often they're getting treatments from other practitioners, and that pain or discomfort will go away until they kind of go back to their life, or they go back to the gym, or they're, playing with their kids or what have you. And so they really end up in my office because they're tired of it and they don't know what else to do. And so I help them put together really sustainable. It's exercise based, but it's very, very different than seeing a personal trainer. Okay. Because I'm really doing underlying body education on how you can actually feel good in your body and how you can move your body in a way that doesn't hurt. So I often have stories of people. I had one this week where I had a client that just started. The woman is 44 years old. She's been in pain for 25 years with a sore butt, basically, and sciatica. Oh, wow. And after working together for 2 weeks, so one session a week, she reported to me this week that she hadn't felt pain at all. So we've kind of zapped 25 years of pain out of her body.
Oh, wow.
So one of the things that I noticed, because I have a private studio, so I work actually privately with people, not a personal trainer at a gym or a big facility. So the door's shut, it's just me and the clients. And I recognized almost a decade ago that almost every single one of my clients who comes to me with body pain also has some sort of imbalance or emotional pain somewhere else in the rest of their life. So as we start to kind of unpeel this pain in the body, out come these stories of basically just real life. So wow. Miscarriages, financial problems, cheating spouses, difficulties with dating, difficulties with children, you name it, I've heard it. And it could be present day, and it also could be something that's happened in the past. People have talked about their childhoods and their challenges with their parents or their siblings or addicted members of their families. So I really started to take quite a strong interest in people's emotional lives. And because all of these stories were also coming at me, I started to take an interest really in my own emotional life, because I didn't come into this job with a full set of preparation and tools for the fact that I was going to be listening to all of these kind of stories about people's lives. So in the past decade, I've really just developed a personal passion for and professional education against really digging into those stories and combining that with the physical movement piece.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you this, because I've read somewhere where you have like trauma from the past, or even trauma, you store that in the body and that can create pain as well. So do you work with clients on that too?
I do. I'm currently working towards a certification in a technique called compassionate inquiry. Some of you may have heard of Gabor Mate, and that is fundamentally the work that he does. So he really is all about trauma, and it's something that I have actually been already doing in terms of the body, but now we're able to really combine that with the sensations of the body and combine that with a psychotherapeutic technique.
Awesome. That is awesome. Okay. So now I want to dig into you being a relationship blogger slash writer for the last 3 years. Like, what led you to do that?
So in the background of my profession, apparently my part-time job has been dating. So I didn't ever plan this or set out to do this, but I'm in my 40s, and at one point I calculated that I'd been on approximately 1,000 first dates. I've never been married, and so although I didn't mean to go on that many first dates, that kind of just happened. And somewhere along the way, I started trying to figure out what the heck was going on, because I hit a certain point in my life where I really did want to make a relationship work. So part of what happened in the earlier years was that I was really focused on my career. It was not a priority for me. It didn't come to my attention. And so when people say it happens when you least expect it, it never did. I never expected it. I was focused on staying busy and really passionately pursuing a career in the fashion media in New York, which I achieved, but I really did not. I kind of batted away dates. I would go on tons of first dates when I lived in New York City, and like literally didn't care if I ever followed up with people. And then I hit a point in my life where I really wanted to make it happen. And it was a kind of a combination between a changed dating landscape and some missing emotional skills in me. But I started to realize that I just couldn't make this work. So even though I had now turned attention to it, and I had already gone on more than enough dates to kind of know what was quote unquote out there, I just wasn't closing the loop. I wasn't able to make a relationship stick. I wasn't able to select a partner that I wanted to stay with. And so I started to do a lot of personal work in that area, and then found myself in a couple of Facebook groups where I then recognized that, you know, having 1,000 dates under my belt by no means made me a dating expert, but it did make me somebody who had a voice, who had experience, and who had lived stories, and that I could actually contribute to adding to the collective pool for people who maybe were coming at it from a completely different angle, a completely different set of experiences. And so I sort of started really jumping into, initially it was just Facebook conversations, and then eventually just doing writing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So with that, I'm pretty sure you've done a lot of research as a writer. You do a lot of research. Like I mentioned a few of the topics that you've written on. So attachment trauma and dating trauma. First, could you explain what attachment trauma is before we just really just dive into that particular section first?
So a lot of us are familiar with attachment theory, and that theory says that we have a couple of different attachment styles, and there's a book called Attached that many of us have read. So that theory and that landscape is out there. Attachment trauma is related, but it's slightly different. So when we're children, we all have caregivers of some kind. Otherwise, we would not survive. We literally would die if we did not have caregivers. When we are that small, basically under the age of 4, we need caregiver attunement, which means care and attention and response to our cries and our needs. Otherwise, our brains actually develop differently. So attachment trauma is actually a trauma from that phase of our life where we did not get that attunement from a parent. It does not mean we were abused, but what it does mean is that our caregiver wasn't responsive in a way that helped our brain actually develop that sense of safety and security. And there is research that shows that the development of emotions and emotional responses and literally the synapses in our body and the chemistry of our brain, that component develops at that very young age. So for example, if we're crying and we have a caregiver who gets annoyed by that, that's going to impact our brain development. If we have a parent who ignores us when we're 2 years old and we're running around the room and trying to get our parents' attention and we're not able to actually successfully generate that, we're going to have a chemical response that is one of trauma. So when we hear trauma, we often think about sexual or physical abuse, but we're not talking about that when we're talking about attachment trauma. So attachment trauma is really that underlying piece where we just didn't have that caregiver attunement. And often this is scenarios where our parents even loved us. So it isn't that we were kind of in a scenario where our parent was angry with us or that they hated us. They potentially didn't have the skill set to give it to us.
The skill set, or would you think of like parents who feel like, I don't want to baby my child too much because the world's not going to baby my child?
Yes. Yes. There is actually a lot of debate about sleep training, for example, because that's a try it out technique. And that is an example where parents often feel like, yeah, they don't want to pick up their child because the child might get too attached or they might become too needy or they might manipulate the parent. That is actually a form of attachment trauma because there is a reason that children cry. There is a reason that it is loud and piercing. There's a reason why when we get on an airplane, we're annoyed by other people's babies crying because it's actually meant to be shrieky and loud to other people's ears. It's meant to get attention. And that attention is actually what that child needs to develop that safe, secure attachment. And that's where that attachment theory is. But it's also what that child needs in order to develop those proper brain mechanisms to attach.
Okay. So in adulthood, say if a child is raised by a parent, like the example I just gave, I don't want to spoil they call it, I don't want to pick up my child, or I don't want to spoil my child because the world's not going to treat my child like I would treat my child. So I need to refrain from picking them up. I need to let them cry. When this child grows up and they don't develop the brain waves or develop that safety net, would you say they grow up as individuals who either don't ask for anything because of their safety net, or someone who's what kind of adult would you say they grow up to be within relationships?
Well, quite often that sort of person, it depends on whether that was limited to just crying it out or if there were other pieces to it. But quite often that adult will actually struggle with their own emotional recognition. They will struggle with communicating their emotions, and they will struggle to actually feel safe within a partnership. So if you've read the book Attached, there aren't actually a ton of super secure people, and it's partially because we just didn't have any of this information prior to 1973. And so basically we're still talking about people who were children or grandchildren of the very thing that you're talking about, which is don't let the child manipulate you, don't pick up the baby because you'll spoil the baby,
Right.
etc. So all of this is on the newer end, and I think really the millennials were the first generation who actually did get that proper emotional attunement and took a lot of heat for it because they got called snowflakes and soft, etc. But most of us are still living in an emotional lineage of people that were traumatized by World War II, or children of alcoholics, or grandchildren
Right.
of alcoholics. And those things actually take multiple generations of healing before we get that proper emotional attunement.
Got you. Okay. In the last article you wrote about attachment trauma, what was the article mainly about?
Well, the article opens with a quote from me.
Okay.
I love you as a human being, as a friend, and as a boyfriend. This is hard for me to say, but it's not working for me. And with those 26 words, I left him. So it's really about my own struggles with figuring out why this sort of thing happened. So when I looked at my own dating history, the last 10 years of men that I've actually gotten into relationships with have had very similar stories. So I actually came to a place where I kind of was laughing because I could basically write a script for how it was going to end before it ever started. And we could just swap out the actors and
Wow.
go. And with all this other work that I was doing, both professionally and personally and in my dating groups, and I could give this great advice, there was something that just didn't add up. And it befuddled me, it befuddled dating coaches, it befuddled my friends. And I had all kinds of, theories and postulations about why this was happening. Everything from you're not feminine enough, to you're giving away your power, to men are just assholes, to you have no self-esteem. But none of those ever landed with me as true. I mean, I was just like, okay, this is very bizarre. Like, I am a really confident, outgoing person who my favorite one was you're not feminine enough. I actually asked an ex-boyfriend about that, and he said, have any of these people giving you this advice ever met a man? Because you're not feminine at all. But I would kind of repeat this story where I would get 3 to 4 months into a relationship, and a minor incident where a man would kind of pull back a bit of attention or get on with something else in his life and not be kind of hyper focused on the relationship. We all know this story. You kind of you move past that sort of initial burst of honeymoon phase where the only thing you talk or think or do is that other person. And the second that happened, I would go into this state of anxiety. And it wasn't anxiety that even felt normal. I don't have anxiety in any other area of my life. So first of all, I felt completely unprepared to deal with it. But second, it was like preoccupied, couldn't think about anything else, felt just this huge panic in my body, felt like I was 2 years old and just like in a state where I couldn't get this person to pay attention to me. And at first I didn't have the communication skills to actually even talk to my partner about it. So I would just hide it. But eventually, through my personal work, I would communicate to my partner, and I learned how to do it in a way that felt safe and felt accurate and was quite genteel. But I would still end up in this same scenario where no matter what I said and no matter how many times we had this conversation, I would get overcome with this sense of panic and preoccupation and just this sense like I'm going to actually suffocate.
Yeah.
So in the article, I actually talked about how it's like, it felt like I had ropes around my chest and they would just get tight and I couldn't even breathe. And then I wanted to get out of the relationship. So even though these were the kind of men that I wanted to be dating and I had those feelings of love, I was like, peace, I gotta go. Like, I want out. And I would end up leaving them. And some of them I fought through that. Some of them I didn't. And it was partly that combination of, it of course takes two people, but it was really this individual where, you know, I really loved him and I wanted to be in a relationship with him, but I literally said those words to him, and it really made me look at what is actually going on, because I met somebody that I think is intelligent and attractive, and he's got all the qualities that I want to be with, and I still pieced out. So so after really digging into myself and working with a mental health professional, we really landed on the attachment trauma, because at the end of it, all of us are kind of reacting and reenacting patterns from childhood when we get to that place where we feel love. We get to that place where we have that emotional connection and that vulnerability with somebody else. And it often is around that kind of 3 to 4 month period where we'll notice that somebody else goes, quote unquote, crazy. And in this case, it was always me. So I couldn't really figure that out either, because I grew up with parents who loved me in a middle-class family. There was nothing wrong. I couldn't pin it on, okay, there was this incident that happened. And yet I kept repeating this over and over. And at some point, I was gifted the information that adult children of alcoholics all have really standard kind of emotional makeups. Well, my mom is an adult child of an alcoholic. And all of a sudden, the pieces just kind of fell into place. So my grandpa was a World War II vet. He came back from the war. It was always spoken of in my family that, with a lot of pride, that he just never mentioned the war again. He didn't join any veterans association. He just started drinking. And that was coping with it. So my mom grew up in this home, and I really don't know anything about what that actually entailed, but I do know that in my childhood, we didn't have our emotions recognized. No one ever helped me understand what any of my emotions were. And my mom actually married, both my parents are really nice people, but my mom married somebody who had a very similar emotional makeup. And so we lived in a family with an emotional range of acceptability that was super, super, super tiny. So we weren't to be too happy or too boisterous, because that was annoying to my parents. Crying was shamed, and because they couldn't handle it, they didn't know what to do with it. So I would often send my sister or I out to the step, and we were to calm down before we could come back. Anger often met with laughter, or I remember being in high school and getting videotaped so that we could.
Oh, wow.
And so my experience and my connection to emotions was zero. So I didn't grow up in a family where I was allowed really to be emotional. And that's not really like my makeup. I'm not hyper emotional, but I have emotions, and I just wasn't walked through the pathway of how to actually address them or feel them or express them or be comfortable with them.
Got you. I have a similar background, but my father was an alcoholic for most of my childhood, and we walked around eggshells, you hear me, through that house all the time. So emotions were obsolete there, and there was we crying, there's no taking to the step. They getting that belt and they tearing us up and giving us a reason to cry. That was our household. And I know me getting into relationships, I have codependency issues. So I get into people pleaser mode in my relationship. So that's something I'm working on for myself, along with other things. And then I've just learned how to properly, and I still don't properly let my emotions out. Now I let them out, though. At first I would try to hold them in. Even if I got to do it angrily, I will let them out now. So that's something I'm working on as well for myself.
It's a huge practice, and it's a lifelong practice. And I I think that one of the pieces of interest for this, for me, was something you just shared, where you could figure out why you might struggle with that because you grew up in the family of the alcoholic. I
Right.
didn't, you know? So I think when I first kind of encountered the idea of trauma, I'm like, well, my parents loved me. That doesn't apply to me. Nothing really stands out in my childhood as being any kind of big deal. I was never hit or abused or anything like that. And that's what the tricky part of all that is, because
I think when you mention the generational, I think because it follows down, even though, you said your mom was she was raised by somebody who drank a lot, she probably did her best not to show you the things she went through, but I don't know if it's like energetically, it still shows, like you said, emotions weren't really expressed in the house and certain things like that. So I just think when people still try not to show their children maybe the bad things they went through, if they're not aware of it, it still subconsciously comes out, like they can't handle their children's emotions or things like that. So
100%.
yeah,
And it's interesting because at some point in the last 5 or so years, I actually asked my mom why she didn't kind of go and get some of the emotional toolkit and work on some of these skills in the way that I have. And I was really fascinated and interested in the answer. And she just said, it was a small town in the 1980s. People didn't do that. People didn't go to therapy. You only would go to therapy if something was really wrong. And so now I always laugh because, who changed it? It was Oprah Winfrey. And
right.
that didn't actually happen until the 1990s. And so we actually forget that a lot of people who were born in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and actually even into the 1990s, just didn't have parents who lived in a culture where this was just part of what we do. It's almost unfathomable today because self-help is everywhere, and there's conversations about traumas and attachment theory everywhere. And it's almost unusual if you encounter somebody who doesn't do any of this work. But it wasn't that long ago when nobody did this work because Oprah hadn't found her spirit yet. So
it amazes me that you say that. I know I've had to seek out people who's doing this work because honestly, within my community, there's still not a lot of people who's doing the work. Like they'll see the memes and they'll share it and they'll be cute with it, but they're not fully doing the work. They don't fully understand. That's part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I want to really like push it in their face. Like, okay, you don't want to read a book. You don't want to do the work. Well, let me create a podcast. Let me put an app together that will push these things, because I feel like it is important, because you can't build a relationship when you don't know yourself, when you don't know what you're doing subconsciously and you're just on autopilot. And I think that's a lot of our problems. Like we're just on autopilot. So
absolutely. And I think that we don't think that the stuff applies to us. So I know
right.
A friend told me to read the book Attached about 7, maybe as long as 8 years ago. And when I first read it, I was totally underwhelmed. I'm like, okay, there's a lot of conversation about this book, but whatever. I don't even get how this applies to me. But that has really seeped into my soul in a way, because I didn't think that any part of that book had anything to do with me. And then I was like, okay, she told me to read this for a reason. So like, let's look at it again. But it really took me actually a couple of years of tracking my own behavior and being like, oh yeah, I do that. So
yeah.
especially when the stuff comes from our family, it's just kind of normal. It's just how we do
right.
it. And then we go off and we meet other people who actually quite often are wired just like us. So 15 years ago, I can definitely tell you most of my friends were just like me. And we didn't sit around and talk about our emotions. We talked about the stuff we were doing, and we talked about our day-to-day lives and the events and activities, but we didn't dig into the emotions. And as I have changed and matured, and fortunately for me, I actually moved, and so then my social network is different and I have different conversations. But I think we end up going from our family to our group of friends and potentially partners who actually are just like us, and we don't notice that anything's wrong. So we usually don't even think, hey, this information does apply to me, because we surround ourselves with people that feel chemically
Familiar,
familiar.
chemically, right, right. Totally agree. I know what did it for me, because I never thought anything was wrong with me. I was always the perfect one. Okay, until and I always was the one to break up with people until this guy broke up with me. And it really made me look at myself like, what the anyway. But yeah,
Yeah.
that situation really made me look at myself and look at the things that I was doing and how I could grow and change. So yeah, I definitely can relate to just always kind of just attracting to kind of going to what's familiar, so you don't recognize that until something kind of abruptly happens. Or
Absolutely. And
yeah,
I think that we need to actually do this long enough to start to see patterns. And dating is kind of a bit of a weird thing, because most of us will live in multiple places in our lives, or drive multiple cars, or have multiple friends, or go over to multiple people's houses. But the average person only has about 6 relationships in their life. And statistically, only 2 of those are kind of what's considered major relationships that last over a year and a half. So most of us really don't know what we're doing, because
right.
we don't actually get enough experience. I mean, what do you know about something you've done 5 times or 2 times? You know almost nothing about it. If I was to play a new sport tomorrow and I was to do it 2 times, I would be bad at it. I would have
Right.
no idea what was going on. If I did it 5 times, I still would probably be really bad at it. So when it comes to selecting partners and mates, most of us don't have a darn clue. And we live in a culture that really blames other people. Oh, this guy did this thing, and oh my God, and oh my God. If we go onto Facebook, we could find probably multiple thousands of groups where we could find people of both genders complaining about other people's behavior.
Right.
Much more rare for somebody to say, hey, I just noticed a pattern in myself because this is the 6th time it happened. So I
Right.
think it's kind of that combination of, we just don't have the experience, and we're living in a culture where, especially with dating, everything is someone else's fault, and
Right.
it's definitely just some asshole or some jerk or some crazy person. And so, especially again, if you're kind of in that pool and you're participating in some of those groups on Facebook, it it isn't a culture where we turn that lens to ourselves. We just bitch and moan and whine and complain about how someone else has wronged us.
Right. And it's not healthy when you can't look at yourself. And that's something I've learned. Because like I said, I was perfect. You hear me? Like 2 years ago, I was perfect. You couldn't tell me shit. Okay. That guy broke up with me, and I was like, well, damn. Okay, well, this leads to dating trauma. So I would love to hear your thoughts on dating trauma. It sounds like, yeah, we've been touching a little bit on it, but tell us about dating trauma and just the things you wrote about in regards to that.
So that was a term that I actually made up. So where attachment trauma is an actual clinical term, and it's something that mental health doctors will address and bring up, and there's books about attachment. Dating trauma is literally something I'd never heard anybody talk about, and I put those 2
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. So yeah, if you could go into detail about that.
So as I already mentioned, I jumped into the pool of Facebook where I was having these conversations about dating. And what I really started to notice was that, especially females, and I mean, I can't speak for males to be honest, but we get a lot of advice that on dates we're supposed to be open and warm and vulnerable and flirty and emotionally available. And then if the date doesn't work out, or he ghosts us, or we don't like him, or we never talk to him again, we're just supposed to be stone cold about it. So we're supposed to have all these emotions as long as we're on the date and available to continue dating this person. But the second that we're not, the advice that we're given is, don't let it bother you. Don't give your power away. What are you upset about? It's only been 1 date. Things like that. Or the age-old classic, the best way to get over somebody is to get under somebody else. So we really have this interesting dichotomy in dating where we're supposed to be Brene Brown on the date, but if things don't work out, we're supposed to be avoidant.
Right. So how do you, is that really a healthy way to balance that situation? And how,
No,
okay, because how would
no,
you balance it? Yeah, because that's when people talk about being in your feminine energy and lay back, those are the traits that you just described. And then it's like, and then when you decide to say you get upset and you kind of chase them a little bit, trying to figure out what's going on. Oh, you're in your masculine energy. You're
totally,
doing too much. And it's just kind of
totally.
like, okay, so what the fuck do I do? Like,
100%. Totally. So that was the genesis of where that term came from, because I actually felt like something was wrong with me, because what would kind of happen on a fairly regular basis was that I would go on 10 or 15 or 25 first dates, and then there would be one guy that I would go on one first date with, and I would kind of snap. And I would call friends and I'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened, and just get so upset about it. But it really wasn't ever about that guy. It was about the 15 or 20 people before that, where I had gone into this really open heart space with my date, and then I couldn't get past that second date. And I noticed that there was no room in our conversations for saying that hurt me. I'm upset about that. I feel really vulnerable about that. I feel rejected by that. I feel upset about that. And so I referred to it as dating trauma, where we can actually put name to the kind of, I call it like paper cuts, when we're on this dating circuit, which many of us are on,
right.
and swiping. We engage in all these different conversations, and 97% end up in ghosting or getting unmatched. We can't pretend that in the most emotional space of our life, where we're looking for that really emotionally deep connection, that we're not going to eventually get emotionally upset. And we recognize in our culture that divorce is upsetting and divorce is traumatizing.
Right.
But anything less than that, and we'll hear things like, well, you were only dating for a month. You were only dating for 6 months. You only went on one date. And we just minimize and eliminate the fact that those are actually unprocessed, because we're not allowed to process them. So those are unprocessed grief and fear and shame and loss,
Right.
etc. So name the list of emotions, and we have no cultural outlet for expressing that, because if we go on one date with a man and we're upset about it, it doesn't matter even if it's the 27th time this has happened to us. We literally can't go to girlfriends. We can't write about it. We can't put it in Facebook groups that we're just feeling upset, because we're told to stay positive and we're told to stay open, or we're told to just not worry about it and don't give our power away. So like you said, what the fuck are we supposed to do? And it ends up traumatizing us, because we have no outlet for that sense of expression.
Got you. Okay. Got you. Dating trauma. I like that. I like that. You should start a group like on Facebook or Instagram with dating trauma and
I should.
women. You should. Like, I should start like a podcast segment about that, because that does happen a lot. And I know, yeah, a lot of my friends, well, it was only one date, and then they'll kind of put it in the back of their heads and then don't mention anything about it. I know my best friend, like she'll like a guy, and she gets attached to me quickly. But I know, and she knows that I think that, but at the same time, I let her express how she feels at the same time, though. Just because I feel that way, that doesn't mean the relationship was very real to her. So I know I let her express her emotions and talk it out until she is okay. So,
But the reality is, we were never, as human beings, meant to have these little mini catalog shopping experiences on Tinder, where we swipe through
right,
700 profiles in the course of a week. We were never historically presented with 3 to 5 dates a week, or dating multiple people. At the current moment, we are encountering more people in our
Right.
single days on Facebook and social media than we would have ever encountered in our entire life. So my grandma is 98 years old, and she grew up on a farm. She married my grandpa, who lived on the neighboring farm. And I think about how different that is than my experience, which is picking up my phone and swiping through 150
Right.
candidates, choosing a couple that I think are okay, then exchanging a couple texts, and then having a couple phone calls, and then going out with a couple of them. And so I think that we don't have anything biological that says don't attach to these people. Our biology actually says we're developing relationships, and we're naturally going to be upset when they disappear. But that's seen in our culture as needy and shameful behavior. We're not supposed to do that, but that's how humans are wired. And pain in our emotional body actually registers to our brain the same way that physical pain does. So we don't really have great mechanisms for recognizing it's painful. And in fact, we shame people who develop these little mini attachments, but
Got
that's
you.
what we're supposed to do.
I think so. I read, it's funny, like we're talking about this because I read this meme today and it says our brains are wired for connection, like
Yes.
but our trauma rewires them for protection. So I think people like myself who feel like, oh, she's real quick, or, you know what I'm saying? I think me, because when we get back to attachment theory, I have a fearful avoidant attachment style. So I do my best not to, I try to dismiss feelings quickly, but I think that's because from my trauma, I try to rewire that to protect myself. So yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I think it's really interesting because, in my opinion, and that's all it is, it's not a fact, it's an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Online dating is really set up around a system of avoidance, and for that person like yourself, because it's really set up around the concept of we're not going to develop any attachment, we're not going to develop any connection, there's someone else around the corner. And so we get this really weird system where everybody's looking for that connection, but the entire way that the apps are structured and the cultural kind of way that we proceed about this is set up for playing this game of kind of dating chicken, where nobody wants to admit that they have any feelings. Nobody wants to
Right.
be the first to actually admit that they're attracted. Everybody's kind of waiting for the other person. There's a ton of ghosting. There's a ton of unmatching wordlessly.
Right.
There's a ton of super avoidant behavior. And we, in fact, tend to tag people who are looking for that connection as quote unquote needy. And that's a really negative term in our society. So it's really challenging because our brains are wired for that connection. As babies, we literally die without connection to human.
Right.
And historically, we were tribal people. I mean, we still are actually tribal people, but if you were in a tribe in the Serengeti and they pieced out and left you, again, you would die. So we actually are very much wired to connect and bond with other people. But our dating culture says that there's a certain time that you're supposed to do this in, there's a certain procedure that you're supposed to use, and God forbid you get somebody who does this in a different speed than other people.
Okay. I can agree to most of that. I do feel like avoidance love the dating apps because they don't want to fully connect, but then I know there's also people who do want to connect and they get on the date because that's the best way now to get on. That's where everybody's at. It's not like what we were talking about back in the day. I was listening to this other podcast and the lady was talking about how she met her husband. They all lived in the same town. Everybody kind of hooked up with whoever they went to school with, and that was it.
Mhm.
You know? And like now, yeah, we have this technology and you have all of these options.
I think dating apps are amazing because we do get to meet people that we wouldn't otherwise meet. And we do get to be in a phase of life where we may not otherwise encounter people. So, look at COVID. COVID would have completely shut down dating, but it didn't because people had apps. They could still intersect. They could talk on the phone. They could do video dates. And
Yeah.
in some jurisdictions they could actually meet up, others they couldn't, but people could still continue to try to work on those connections. We also get people that are single parents who might find it really difficult to date. We get people that are of certain age groups that might struggle a little bit more to find people to meet in a bar. Right. We get people that work at home who, you know, it wasn't that long ago, and the number one place to meet people was your office, but from home, how are you going to meet someone, or an introverted person? So it opens and levels the playing field, and I do like that part of it. But I also think that dating apps have created some less desirable, less optimal conditions for people to try to date in, because I'm old enough that I actually remember dating without them, and the pace of it was different, and there wasn't such an assumption that in fact, people weren't, because that you're dating other people. So not to say that everybody was kind of exclusive back in the day, but you had to go to a bar and meet people. And so it was unlikely that you were such a player that you were actually dating 6 people at a time.
Got you. Okay.
Because it was a lot of effort. And people used to date by talking on the phone first, and etc. So it wasn't that long ago. We just had a very different system and speed of doing this.
Got you. Okay. I know I like dating apps, not totally because I'm just this avoidant, but I do like the aspect of meeting new people and seeing where things go. I haven't been on a dating app in a while though, because like I said, I've realized I have some shit to clean up within myself. So that's what I'm working on now. But yeah, I can agree on a lot of levels about dating apps and the culture of dating now. So that's why I think these topics are so important. The new phrase, dating trauma, I think you really should start something with that. That's dope. And then again, stuff like attachment trauma and attachment theory and stuff like that. I think more people need to know about it and to understand why they do the things that they do. Because when I came to knowledge of it, now I'm more concerned about how people feel and stuff like that. And I don't just ghost people and break things off, because now I know why subconsciously, why I do the things I do, and why do I feel like I need to protect myself, or I need to get you before you get me. Like, I know now why I do those things. So yeah, that's why I created this podcast and everything else I'm trying to create.
Yeah, I think there's research that shows that the number one indicator of a quality life, which is another word really for happiness, really comes down to our satisfaction with our relationships. Right. So it's more important than your career. It's more important than your education. It's more important than your clothes or your body or your material belongings or what vacations you're taking. It's more important than literally anything else. And so I think that putting that time and attention into self-development, into self-understanding, into looking at our childhood wounds and our trauma, right, and how we're wired, and trying to get those different skills will literally change the quality of your life. And there's nothing else that's going to change it as much as that, because this is what it really comes down to, is how connected are you to other people? And if you have attachment traumas, or you have an avoidant attachment set of behaviors, or anxious, it's going to really impact how you feel about your life. And, you know, I can speak to this for myself, but I used to try to get that happiness from exercise, or from alcohol, or from shopping, and just kind of cycling through these different things where I'm like, the happiness is going to be in here. And it never was. And it's really because I was really just struggling to attach to other people.
Gotcha.
And so I think a lot of us can probably relate to that, where we feel like something's missing and we're kind of constantly looking for it. But it's because it all really comes down to how much we can connect within ourselves and how much we can have safe connection to other people.
Got you. Okay. Let me ask you this. What would you say is the hardest lesson you had to learn within love and relationships and dating? And then how do you apply that today?
I think one of the things that This is actually the only thing I really kind of regret. And that's a silly thing to do because I didn't even have the skill set to do it. But I think that we often think we have nothing but time. And again, as we kind of look at our culture, that age of marriage goes up, and we're increasingly focused on self-actualization before we meet a partner, and increasingly focused on fully knowing and loving ourselves before we know and love someone else. But the fact is, there's a clock ticking. And I think one of the hardest things for me to come to terms with was I got to my late 30s and recognized that I didn't really take best advantage of the dating market when I was 10 years younger, because there is research that shows that there are fewer people in the dating market consistently over time. So the older you get, the fewer options you have. And that doesn't mean that there's no options. It doesn't mean that you need to get scared by that. But I think we need to get to this place where we can feel like it's enough. We can do that work of self-love and self-actualization within the relationship, and not to kind of be constantly on the hunt for the perfect job and the perfect house and the perfect body before we get that relationship, because it does get harder after age 35. It does get harder even after the age of 30. And so actually prioritizing that a little bit earlier in my life would have been of benefit, because although, you know, I wasn't doing this kind of relationship work, I look back and think, I probably would now choose to go back to that age of around 30 and put this level of attention and dedication and effort into it. And, you know, I can't change that, but the older we get, the more likely it is that we're going to encounter avoidant people in the dating market. The more likely it is that we're going to encounter people who've done no internal work. The more likely it is that we're going to encounter people who have a lot of trauma. And in my case, I'm dating men who are slightly less likely to do the self-work, to do that emotional work. Again, in my case, I'm dating typically Generation X and sometimes even baby boomer men. And those times were really different for men, where they were really socialized and acculturated to not ever share any emotions. And so then we've got a lot of very emotionally wounded men who aren't necessarily doing that self-work. And they are literally, there's research that shows they kind of just recycle again and around and spin around the dating market. And that's often who's left. And so we can't ever go back and change our life, but I think that is a message that I would give to women, especially if marriage and a family is a goal, is it's overlook that cultural pressure of you've got time, there's lots of time. And I'm not saying to fling yourself into it, but prioritize that as well as your career. And don't be afraid to be a woman who sits across the table on a first date and says, I want to get married and I want to have children. We're told that it's going to scare men. Great. Bye-bye. Wave goodbye. Let him go. Right. I was really afraid to actually be emotionally honest because I didn't want to scare away men. But in retrospect, I should have let them go instead of trying to twist and bend myself into being accepted, because if they didn't want to get married or they weren't emotionally mature enough to do it, I was wasting my time. So I think that just really owning that and doing that work earlier and getting yourself into that position where you can be in that healthy relationship somewhere between age 28 and 30, you're going to do yourself a huge favor versus kind of waiting another 10 years to do it.
Damn, that was my plan too, to wait another 10 years. Thanks for the advice. I just hit 30 a couple months ago. Thanks for the advice.
30 is a perfect age, because I actually find that that's where it's kind of that nice merging of men are generally a little bit more settled and grounded and more available for those more permanent relationships. It's a great age to start considering having children. And so really that's where that screening can happen. You can really show up and actually get serious. And if a partner isn't in that phase, well, he's not the right partner. And it's really a great opportunity to find someone else who is.
Right. And that's something I had to learn too from my past. I wouldn't want to scare people away, and I wouldn't ask certain questions, or even if they said something to offend me, I kind of would just let it kind of slide because I wasn't trying to break anything off or ruffle any feathers. But now I'm like, fuck that. So
Same. Yeah.
Right.
I think again, I mean, we're socially acculturated as women to not be too much. And I put that in quotation.
Right.
We are acculturated not to ask men questions that would quote unquote scare them. At the end of the day, people don't really love this word, but we live in a patriarchy, and patriarchy is really all about men's comfort and power. And in order to actually sustain that system, it means that women become helpless and powerless, and we're trained to not say these things, and we're trained to shut our mouth, and we're trained to actually cultivate sexual and emotional freedom for men. And often we're doing it at our own discomfort. And
Right.
so we sit there with this anxiety on dates of, oh, I don't want to say anything and I don't want to scare them. But why are men not told anything?
Right.
Change their behavior or change their thought pattern or change their conversations? They're not. And so, I'm a fierce proponent of learning communication and doing it fearlessly. And it does not mean it needs to be abrasive or unkind,
Right.
but literally sitting on a first date and finding out what someone else's intentions are, literally sitting on a first date and going through that list in your head of those deal breakers and getting rid of men who, it's not our responsibility as women to bend and twist our life. And if we're uncomfortable with having sex, don't have sex. It doesn't matter what he thinks. If we want to get married, say you want to get married. Don't worry about what he thinks. So I think that we are just so cultured to do what you just said. And so many women spend a decade or more unpeeling that and having to learn to stand in our voice and stand in our power and stand in our opinions.
Right. Totally agreed. Okay. Let me ask you this. Where can the audience find you?
So you can find my writing on Elephant Journal. If you go to elephantjournal.com, I have a writer bio and you can follow that. And I do publish articles about other topics. So I write about more than just dating, but there is a whole back library of dating articles. To directly converse with me, you can do that through my website, which is mybodycouture.com. So that's 3 words, my, M-Y, body, B-O-D-Y, couture, C-O-U-T-U-R-E, and that's at the .com. If you want to bypass my website, you can just go to the same business name, My Body Couture, on Instagram or Facebook. You can follow me, you can message me, you can send me a little note telling me that you heard me here and you just want to connect, and I respond to all my DMs.
Awesome. Okay. And I will have all of those links in the show notes. Janis, I want to thank you for your time, your energy, and your presence. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And until next time, guys.
Thank you for tuning in to today's show. If you like this podcast, please download and subscribe. If there's anything you would like to talk about in regards to relationships, or would like to be a guest on the show to speak on relationships or get advice, you can always connect via social media at Playing for Keeps, or email DJ at info@p4kdating.com. Thank you for tuning in, and bye for now. Stay tuned. The dating app Playing for Keeps will be launching this June.